Hello, welcome to Unit 2, the History of Western Philosophy, Part 1, which I have titled The Mythic Age. So, in order to have a better grasp of philosophy and philosophical thinking, it's good to first think about what preceded what we would call philosophy. How were people thinking and wrestling with the big questions of life before philosophy, properly speaking, was begun? Philosophy is not the beginning, of course, of human thinking or human curiosity. People have always asked questions of the world around them. And in particular, people have always asked big questions of identity. I call these meta questions. And those would include who am I or who are we? Where do I come from or where do we come from? Where am I or we going? How do we get there? What is reality? How do we know that we really know? And things of that nature. In antiquity, and in many places even up to now, the big questions of life were usually handled by religious explanations. A lot of people have called this the divine inclination. This idea that there's a latent belief. In other words, it's unspoken, it's not on purpose, but there's this belief system in human beings that naturally tends to say that or tends to tell us that there's a spirit world or a world beyond what we can obviously see that is more in charge of events and things around us, even than those things that we can detect or we can see with our eyes. A spiritual reality, basically. Even Neanderthals, the, so to speak, cavemen, had obvious aspects of religion. They had carvings of the mother goddess, little pregnant carvings in their caves, which are widely dispersed. There were sacred areas within cave dwellings, and they buried items with dead people. So, for example, we've found the skulls of cave bears, the large cave bears that used to exist and probably competed, for space with Neanderthals since they lived in caves, largely. We found the heads of cave bears buried with Neanderthal who had died. So whether they were hunting trophies or some sort of spiritual essence, we don't know, of course. But we do know that there was a religious sensibility even to pre-modern man, much less, modern people or Homo sapiens sapiens that just lived a long time ago. They have even more obvious religious artifacts in their dwellings. Something that very few people know, even though sometimes it's taught in high school history courses, sometimes not. But the word history, when we say something is a matter of history, we shouldn't just mean that as it happened at some point in the past. That's the colloquial usage of history. It's history. In other words, it happened before now. But when we say history as a subject, we're really talking about the story of humankind after the invention of writing. It's strange to think, but human beings have not always had a system of writing, a formal system of writing. We may have expressed ourselves symbolically or carved shapes. Certainly there were cave drawings in cave dwellings, but there was not a formal system of writing as such, a symbolic expression of thought that was systematized and could express deep, complicated, intricate stories or explanations. We start to see writing developing around 300 BCE. For those of you who are confused about university terminology, usually we use the designations BCE and CE, so before Common Era and Common Era, rather than BC and AD, because BC and AD presume a Christian context to that dating system. On the other hand, we don't want to confuse everyone by completely changing the calendar that you're accustomed to. So what's used instead is BCE and CE. So don't get confused by that. BCE basically means BC. And CE, or Common Era, means starting with the year 1 of what would have been called AD. So around 3000 BCE, we see the civilization of Sumer, which started in the Fertile Crescent, or what is today Iraq. And Sumer had several cities, Uruk, and most importantly, Babylon, that are the earliest places where we begin to see systems of writing. And here on the slide, you'll see a little tablet or a little rock inscribed with characters from Sumerian writings. It's very intricate. It's very hieroglyphic in a sense, but also it is alphabetical. With the advent of writing, we begin to say that that is the beginning of history. And it's historical because we have a record of what people thought and believed. Before that, before recorded history, we usually just call that prehistory. And if we study it, we often call it, just a matter of early human anthropology, right? So Sumer and most of the civilizations that grew up at the same time, in fact, I would almost dare to say all of the civilizations, that the early civilizations, were city civilizations. Okay, you can't yet think in terms of nations as a continuous amount of land mass with sovereignty. It tended to be based around individual cities that governed, that they were like a hub. The area around them might affiliate or consider themselves to be a part of that city, under that city's protection and under that city's governance and laws. But the city itself was the center point. It was a place of exchange, a place of gathering, and a place of physical defense. So cities began to grow mostly because of the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution is the period in history where there is intentional crop farming. So we see people leave their nomadic lives and set up city civilizations, okay, big systems of living together. And at the same time, we're seeing the, if you will, the literary revolution, which is to say, as people begin to congregate in central spaces, large numbers of people living together, we see the development of writing, literature, and legal codes. So as these groups became larger than nomadic clans, they also begin to adopt a group identity. So initially we would call these city-states. I am a member of this city, or I am a member of the people around this city. Later on, this develops into the idea of nation-states as particular cities expand their influence over other cities. And we begin to think of it as empires. So these people groups are larger than families, but probably smaller in many respects than we would consider today like a whole ethnic group. For example, today we might say that the people who have a heritage in the Middle East are all Semites. They're Semitic people. But the further back you go, the more that would break down into individual people groups, individual nations. Hebrews, Kurds, Ugarites, Egyptians, Arabs, okay, very particular groups of people. And when you get larger and larger groups of people, it's important that those people have or adopt a common identity, a group identity. So this is the same way that even though you and I and the guy in the back of the room and the woman teaching the class, or whatever, we are all very different people. We have different ideas, different values sometimes, different strengths and weaknesses, different things we want out of life. But we might say that we are all Americans. And in that sense, we have adopted or created a group identity. Now, identities cannot be constructed out of thin air. They have to be based on something, or at least on the perception of something in common. Usually, in fact, almost universally, in prehistory and in early history, what we see is that groups create a uniting story, which we will call mythology. They have a common mythology, in other words, a common story of their origins, right? We are the group of people, and this is our history. And they also tended, by extension, to have a legal code. As you've got more and more people living together who consider themselves one group of people with one story and one set of values, those values become expressed in legal codes that govern the interaction between people. Now, usually these legal codes, we should note, they pertained to the group. In other words, this is our city. We are the people of this city, and these are our laws. There wasn't the sense of universal human rights or something like that. Okay, that's much later. But even at this point, those people who wanted to join the group adopted these codes in order to govern themselves. So, okay, we've already talked about this a little bit, but to say it again, so the common mythology, or just the mythology, is adopted. It's a story of origin and of purpose, or of destination. And it's the basis of a civilization's religion. So religion comes from mythology. Contained within the mythology are stories of the divine and of greater organizing principles within that people group. And so people derive from that mythology, here's who we are, here's where we come from, here's where we're going. So those are the meta questions, right? They're answering the meta questions through this larger story. And the common law are the rules governing behavior. And we shouldn't think of these as two separate things. The common law was usually an aspect of the common mythology. Okay, so somewhere within the mythology, there were actually rules given by God or gods, recognized by this group of people as their god or gods. And because it came from the beyond, it was obvious that people who belong to these gods, right? These are my gods, and these are the gods' rules. So clearly I should follow those rules, right? It's basically like having God as your judicial branch.